Microscopic hair comparison analysis begins with a very specific, manual process. An examiner takes a hair recovered from a crime scene, mounts it beside a hair taken from a suspect, and places both under a comparison microscope. Under the lens, the examiner studies the visible characteristics of the hair shaft. They evaluate color, pigment distribution, and scale pattern. They also examine internal architecture, the medulla and cortex. These are real, tangible physical traits that can be clearly documented. This initial step is legitimate observation. A trained examiner can look at two samples and accurately state whether they share the same visible characteristics, or if they clearly do not. The problem arises when this observation leaves the laboratory and enters the courtroom. There is a massive logical leap between an examiner noting that two hairs look alike and that same examiner telling a jury that a crime scene hair belongs to the defendant sitting at the table. That leap relies on a single assumption, that two different people cannot have identical-looking hair. But at the time, no scientist had ever actually proven that to be true. Accurately describing visual similarity under a microscope is a valid scientific exercise. Presenting that similarity to a jury as a definitive identification is an unearned leap of logic. To prove a scientific match, you need a statistical foundation. Think of it as a fraction. The numerator, the top number, is the observed visual match between the two samples. But a fraction requires a denominator. That denominator represents a known population dataset. It tells you exactly how common a specific combination of physical traits is within the general public. For microscopic hair comparison, that dataset was never assembled. No one in the scientific community had ever gathered the underlying population data. Without that data, it is mathematically impossible to calculate how many other innocent people walking down the street would have hair that looks identical under the lens. Yet, this mathematical void was effectively disguised when examiners took the witness stand. Testimony rarely stopped at a simple observation of similarity. Examiners were trained to use specific, authoritative semantics, telling juries that a hair was associated with, or consistent with, a suspect. To a lay jury, those carefully chosen phrases implied a definitive link to a specific person. They carried the weight of mathematical probability, even when no math existed. The phrase consistent with naturally invites an obvious follow-up question. Consistent with how many other people? That question remained unanswered in trial after trial, because the baseline statistics required to answer it simply did not exist. Because there was no denominator, the absolute certainty presented to the courtroom was a systemic illusion, one that masked an unvalidated guess. If the statistical foundation was missing, we have to ask why the American justice system accepted this practice without question for decades. The first reason was institutional authority. The technique was championed by the FBI laboratory, the most authoritative forensic body in the country. The FBI trained state and local analysts in the method. As those analysts returned, the practice and its confident courtroom semantics spread outward to jurisdictions nationwide. The second reason was the technological environment. This practice predated DNA. For years, there was no independent, competing scientific method available to audit a hair match and prove an examiner wrong. Finally, there was courtroom deference. The testimony sounded like settled science, and it was delivered by federal experts. Juries and defense teams rarely had a reason to challenge it. That unchallenged ecosystem held until the 1990s, when mitochondrial and nuclear DNA testing arrived. For the very first time in forensic history, DNA provided an independent, objective way to verify the biological origin of physical evidence. Microscopic hair comparison was never a malicious hoax. Examiners were observing genuine physical traits. The systemic failure occurred when trusted institutions allowed a valid observation to be pushed into an unverified leap of logic. With the advent of DNA, the justice system finally possessed the tools to look back and audit decades of those definitive courtroom matches. The scientific method to check the work had finally arrived, but nobody had yet bothered to count how often those visual matches had actually been wrong.